Okay, right. I guess we can move on to Sophie's component here. Sophie?
We can indeed. Yeah, thank you. I'll just get to the right slides. But yeah, essentially this is going to be the next half an hour, 45 minutes or so, talking through what advocacy is, kind of ways in which we may have been engaging with advocacy and WeCount, things that we might have found challenging with advocacy, and kind of bringing some lessons that kind of we've learned from science communication. So both myself, Margarita, and Laura are all from science communication, and that's where we're really interested in understanding effective ways in which we engage the public, decision makers, etc. So we'll share kind of some of the experiences that we have. But yeah, this is obviously no silver bullet. When you engage policymakers, it doesn't mean that action will happen. But there's ways in which we can engage different people that might help stimulate behaviour change. So why this workshop? So it actually came out of a need from the survey. So the citizen survey that we did across Europe, so all of the other cities were included. A lot of people said that, okay, we've got this data, we've analysed this data, I don't know what to do with it. But also some people were saying that they don't see themselves as responsible, or maybe they think it's more the government's responsibility or the scientists. And ultimately, we all kind of have a part to play. Whether or not we have the capacity at the time, of course, will make a massive difference. But there's a way here of kind of maybe sharing some knowledge that might help to support people in advocating for change. So advocate. I'm just going to look at my other slides because this is very small for me. So an advocate is someone who helps others express their views and wishes and stand up for their rights. It's also somebody who works collectively on identifying solutions, inviting all parties to listen to each other's problems. So this is not about kind of individual action that we might be taking, but it's more of a group effort. Often uses research to speak truth to the public and decision makers, working within the system to deliver change projects. And this is where you may distinguish between activism and advocacy, where activists are generally seen as working outside of the system, but there's blurred lines here and they cross. But the key relationships around advocacy are relationships, sound policy and respect. So it's respecting all parties involved, it's building relationships with citizens, decision makers, businesses, etc. And it's coming forward kind of policy ideas that are kind of usable, really. And why do we advocate for change? So a big one is the frustration with the status quo, so not happy with things how they are, or a desire for things to be better. But also to amplify marginalized voices. So they may have the least say in decision making, but may be the most impacted. So poorer communities, for example, are more likely to live by main roads or be exposed to air pollution, or disproportionately to more wealthy communities, as an example. But also, like I was mentioning, about building those relationships with decision makers, because change is a process that needs collaboration. And to change not only policy, but also attitudes and behaviours. So we're working from the system's perspective and also the individual action. So it's an advocate's job is not only supporting people to also advocate for change, but also helping to change different parts of the system. And of course, we can't do all of these things, but they are showing you that such a broad array of activities you can do as an activist, an advocate. So some of those things, and then this is where advocate and activist blur lines, is you can do the research. So like you've all been doing, that is a part of it. But then the kind of the policy level change needs to kind of also take place, or be instigated at least, for kind of a true definition of advocacy. But it's also just about raising awareness amongst community members, so public engagement, but it can also be protests, mobilising and organising like-minded people, so investing time to motivate them and build community. Engaging groups that are not like them as well, so to understand their needs and motivations. Speaking to and building relationships with decision makers. I may be repeating myself here, but it's important, either in person, via consultations, or social media as examples. This is not an endless list. delivering change projects. And I will go into more depth about some of these as well. So using creative methods in person, social and traditional media, and also taking part in participatory democracy. So everything from neighbourhood forums to citizen assembly, citizen juries. And a lot of these kind of terms that may or may not be familiar for you are kind of quite new and novel. So we're seeing more and more governments exploring these kind of ideas. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but the Welsh government did hold a citizens assembly last year. And also fundraising, because to support all of this, we need the money and the resources. So that's also a part of advocacy too. And it may also be just giving money to an organisation, because we can't have the time or energy to do all of this, for example. But it's giving ideas of what we can do or what we might already be doing and not realise that we're already an advocate. So the example I'm going to give here is Barcelona, as just an example of some of the advocacy that happened, but there's very similar models popping up across all of our cities. So Barcelona did a number of things during the project. Some were led by citizens, some were more led by the scientists. So the scientists, for example, went to schools and helped to discuss with school kids about air pollution and how their streets were and how traffic flows were, and got them to design their street as it is today and what they would like in the future. We also have examples of a community group in Barcelona who were already quite active using sensors to measure things like noise and air pollution, who used the data from WeCount. So these are the two images in the bottom right. They used the data to lobby people, lobby MPs and lobby local councillors on social media. And they were also recording videos as well, which is quite impactful, to show examples of speeding. And then there's examples at the top, all those three images are as a co-created action. So both the scientists and the citizens got together to explore data in an analog format and worked within various neighbourhoods to communicate the message of WeCount as well. And I would add, with the example on the bottom right of that community, they actually managed to get their speeds reduced to 10 kilometres per hour. I can't remember exactly how much it was before, but at least 10 kilometres, because of the amount of speeding. So there is examples here of where it works, but bear in mind that they have been doing this for quite some time and had a lot of existing data and a lot of existing support. So I'm going to stop talking for a second, and I'm actually going to send us into breakout rooms now. So I'm assuming no one else has joined, and so if that's the case, we just need 2 breakout rooms. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at 2 questions in our breakout room. So one, this is looking at with our WeCount data. So I already heard someone at the beginning say that they haven't got their data, their WeCount up and running, their sensor. So you can remove that and just use your own experiences from advocacy or not doing advocacy, and answer the first question, which is, what form of advocacy do you take, or what would you like to take? And then the second is the challenges you face in either being an advocate with the current data that you have, or you might face if you become an advocate, for example. So it could be hypothetical, it could be from experience. So it's just 2 questions, and we're going to do that for about 10 minutes or so. And I would add to this that we're going to be doing something called active listening. So this is a really good tool to use, which I will explain contextually later. But essentially, we're going to be listening to each other, and we want to clarify what the other person said. So the first person in your group will go and everyone will listen. And then people will clarify, asking statements such as, what did you mean by this? Or, for example. And then we want to basically summarize back to that person. Okay, so did you mean this? Or this is what I think you said. And then we'll move on. So it's rather than talking about our opinions about what the person said, it's just clarifying what the other person said, no butting in, allowing them to talk, and then we'll move on to the next person. So first of all, is that clear? We've got some nods. Okay, cool. And I'm just going to, okay, so I will assign everyone now. I'm going to open the rooms and I will call you all back in 10 minutes time so we can all then feedback what we learned from one another. But do the facilitators want to briefly recap on what was discussed?
Well, yeah, I think the main themes, and of course, shoot me down in flames if I've got this wrong, guys. But we've been talking about there seems to be a frustration in talking to authorities, and one of the recurring things was in this the authorities seem to be very open and accommodating to start with, but now there's and to use Laura's phrase, the usual suspects they're banging on the door, they're not really getting heard. So one of the things that Mark said was that the use of the data like this helps to support this argument and bolster this argument, and help to get through this. And another issue that was brought up was with regards to things like active travel, which obviously is a popular initiative. Get cars off the road, active travel, but also being mindful of and respectful of different requirements of different transport modes. In this respect, some people need to use their cars, but taking into account these requirements of people, but also then the issues associated with noise and air quality as well. That is pretty much the bullet points, I think.
Great, good summary. Anyone else from your group wants to add anything that you may have missed? Seems like you did a good job. Great, thanks, Lewis. I'll take the next one. Okay, go for it, Ben. You started.
No,
I had
no, it was only that
breath.
Jeremy and I had a really valuable conversation. And Jeremy, would you want to feedback the points that you raised, because they were great?
Okay, I put my mic on because I've had it off because you might hear squeaking and barking in the background, which is the hound. Poor Ben had to put up with his ear being bent by me because it was only the two of us in our room for some reason. But kind of two of the sort of key things as we were talking it through. One was when I sort of explained about an idea I tried to get at in our community for road closure for children's play once a month, say. And the idea didn't go forward because there wasn't, the kind of community was split between those that wanted and those that didn't. And part of those that didn't was kind of, well, the park's close by, but one of the points I was trying to get across was that having something once a month that said the road isn't just for vehicles actually gives a message, out to other road users that there might be alternative ways, and the road isn't just for trundling along, because it's quite a straight street where I live. So it's that's kind of frustrating that I think people see some things in silos and say, oh, well, that's catered for. And it wasn't, oh, we haven't got anywhere for children to play, therefore we should do this. It is part of trying to get the street back for multi-use, not just for vehicles. And the sort of the second bit, which was first in the discussion, was about using the data that we'd had lots of near misses and a few accidents at a junction. And obviously council priorities, they look at things relative to other parts of Cardiff and where they spend the money. So we were hoping that the data would be collected, would help, because what we didn't want is to have lots more accidents to push us up the list of priorities, but is to try and use the data. In fact, we have had confirmation that they're going to do some traffic calming around that junction for us. So that was it.
Great.
I'll turn the mic off now so you don't get any squeaking on barking.
Oh, no problem. But yeah, that's a really great example. So thank you for sharing. And Paul, I wonder if you want to share your experiences as well.
Yeah, sure. So For those who don't know, myself and Ken are both part of an organisation called Cardiff Cycle City. Some of you will know of us, some of you won't. For those who don't know Cardiff Cycle City, we're a Cardiff-based cycle campaigning and advocacy group. I'll say a few things pertinent to kind of me, but also kind of a kind of something that's potentially useful for the wider group. So in terms of advocacy I've done for my individual WeCount TELRAM data, I've not used it in anger yet. We at Cardiff Cycle City, we're quite lucky as a campaigning group in that we have a good relationship with partly the Welsh Assembly, but particularly with Cardiff Council. So we know a lot of the people in the transport department in Cardiff Council, right up to Carrow Wild, which is good. And we do have their ear. We view ourselves and they view us as kind of critical friends. So we can cajole them politely when we don't necessarily agree with their stance. One of the reasons there's a few reasons why I've not used my data yet. One of the reasons is I've been happy to go with Cardiff Council's priority over the last 18 months or so, which has been the city centre I live out in, sort of Clannishan, Rabina area. I was saying to Sophie and Margarita that may change because a lot of you all know the old HMRC tax office site in Clannishan, which was proposed to be redeveloped as housing. It now looks like Cardiff Council's bought that site back, and that's going to become a high school and a special school. So I may now start using the TELRAM data to try and cajole Cardiff Council into making sure that if they do roll out a couple of schools there, that they are active travel schools and that they're putting in place decent infrastructure around that area to support what I guess would be a big school, because it's a big site. So what it means for you folks, we're not necessarily a magic bullet, but I mean, if any of you are struggling to make inroads via local councillors or the Cardiff Council or the Welsh Assembly, by all means reach out to us at Cardiff Cycle City. If the committee is agreeable, we can try raising stuff to the council on your behalf. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean that things will get done, but we are quite lucky that we have that relationship. So it might potentially bear fruit if you want to engage with us.
Thank you, Paul. Is it possible you could share if you've got any link to a website or anything for your group or any contact details in the chat? Maybe that would be helpful for people.
I'll stick
it. I think that was really useful to hear from different perspectives and the frustrations. I know those. But also some of the kind of the potential avenues for exploring ways to connect to the council, for example, is really great to see. So the next section is going to be telling us a bit more about kind of some of the ways that we can kind of overcome some barriers, some of which you may have discussed. But bear in mind, so this is for people who may not have engaged in advocacy before, so it sounds like there's a lot of knowledge in the room already, but maybe there's things that you might take away from the next upcoming slides. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about why views and wishes are not always heard or well received. So this is based on 4 different factors, really. So the message and the messenger, personal psychological factors, environmental, and the exclusion of marginalised voices. So I'll go through those in turn now. So ban cars, cycle, work from home. These are obviously clear messages, messages that will not resonate with the majority of people. And the reason for that is because they are not relevant to people's everyday lives necessarily, relate to what they value or are sensitive to their needs and motivations. So they're very kind of without context or kind of shaping towards a particular kind of community. So I'm going to give the example of, say, working class mums. So they are, in this scenario, driving their kids to school or taking them to their hobbies. And for engagement with an audience like these, we need to think about, okay, what relates to their everyday lives, being a parent, and also the things that they value, for example, and all these other dimensions. So a different type of message could be, find out how we can work together to for cleaner air for our children and healthier, happier streets where kids can play and the birds can sing. And of course, this is a very pie in the sky phrase that I kind of pulled out. But it's an example of showing where we're talking about working together collaboratively, which I think is a strong motivation for a lot of people. But also the idea of play is a really kind of foundational motivation, as well as things such as health, things as future generations or our children if we have them. And also sometimes in some contexts, you can find that nature recovery can also be really helpful to help kind of get people really interested in certain conversations around, say, reducing car use. So rather than going with that message, thinking more broadly about those kind of issues. And the messenger is just as important. So sending a man in a business suit to speak to a room full of mums, so a mums group, for example, is not going to be very effective because it's not someone that is like them. So it's really important here to find someone that is going to be a credible and legitimate voice for that community, and someone that they trust. So if you can find a working class mother, then that's really great, to go along and represent, to have those conversations, but also to talk about their own challenges, about how they've had issues, say, reducing car usage or whatever. It's not about putting judgment on people or passing the blame or guilt. It's around having a conversation about the challenges of trying to make a change and actually going through a process to figure out ways in which we can find solutions that work for that specific group. So beyond the message and the messenger, there's like the more personal psychological aspect. So fundamentally, change is hard. We have very inbuilt habits and behaviors that we build over a lifetime. And yeah, they can become very stuck. So finding ways to overcome those is really important, and I'll talk about those in a moment. But then it's also uncomfortable and often inconvenient to make a change, and we have a bias to go for comfort and convenient. So that's also another reason why we don't want to necessarily take a leap to drive less or to walk more, because it might mean that they have to go out in the cold a bit more, and maybe it takes them longer initially while they find their way. And then this clinging to thoughts or limiting beliefs and personal identity. So I do drive. This is what I do. I take my kids to school in the car. This is what I've always done, rather than being exposed to possibilities. And it's easy for us to fall into those traps. But it's finding ways to explore those a bit more, to understand that beneath those layers that there might be room for negotiation. And the ways that we can kind of overcome some of these, so like what I was saying with the message and the messenger, it's facilitating a space with their peers to discuss issues safely, openly and freely. So going to specific groups, target audiences maybe that aren't representative in your campaign organisation, or maybe even you want to kind of get involved with, and actively listening, so like we were doing before, to understand what their values, needs, motivations are. Discuss the challenges, as I kind of briefly mentioned, before kind of moving on to potentially crafting or co-creating solutions with them. But also emphasize that we have a capacity to change, and show them. And it's got to be something that's slow and incremental, more likely, depending on where they are in their life. So if it's a period of life transition, which I put at the bottom, where they're a new mother or they've just moved to a city or they're a student, maybe they can make bigger changes. But normally it's slow and incremental ones that over time you realise you've stopped using the car because you no longer need it. And then using inclusive and encouraging language as well. So again, not using words like should or things that make people feel guilty. It's really supporting people and reinforcing good actions that they're taking, and kind of being in a supportive environment, so people can, it's almost like a kind of Weight Watchers, you could think of it like, where people come back and they get rewarded and they feel good for what the deeds that they're doing, so it keeps them coming back. And in this case as well, it would often be reaching out to existing groups that may not be engaged on these topics, so they've probably got a sense of trust and community already formed. And then environmental factors. So our behaviours don't exist in isolation. They are really shaped by our environment, and all these other social factors. So living at home with your family, with your dog, all these things. You have to take the dog for a walk, that influences you going out and being more active in that sense, as an example. And I was talking about safe spaces and the sense of going out to a community or even in your own campaign group. But when you go out to public and private spaces, then those good intentions may not persist, because we've got partners who don't want to drive less. And I'm using the example of driving less because it's quite clear in my mind, but you can use other examples. So yeah, there's different dynamics at play. So overcoming them, there's a few different tactics we could use. So one example is nudging. So nudging is about purposely disrupting our environment to challenge social norms. So you've got an example here on the far left of Udenplan Station, which is in Stockholm, and they made some musical steps to go alongside the escalator. And the experiment they did, it increased usage of the stairs by 66% compared to a control group. And then you've got examples of, say, like guerrilla cycle lanes that happened during lockdown, and now some of them have been made permanent. And then you've got on the right hand side speed bump and opting out of, say, green energy. So if the opting out is the default, then it's more likely that you're going to get people to just go straight for green energy. But the caveat with these is that there's two types of nudging. There may be more, but the main ones that I'm looking at on the left is the moral one. So it might actually be something that's more kind of really noticeable in the landscape and might wear off after its novelty fades. Whereas the ones on the right hand side are kind of very subtle and almost unconscious. So that's the kind of caveat when you do some kind of actions that could be really fun and creative. They might not sustain themselves if they're a bit more on the moral side of things. Also influencing within organisations, your home, etc. So it's once you have an engagement strategy with communities, or even if it's individuals on the street, it's okay, what action can they take back with them to their house, or what conversations do they need to have at work, for example, to make sure that it's easier for them to make that change. Peer support and role models are really important here. So in the example of work, it's maybe getting a group together who might want to car share, or it's getting similar like-minded people together to create something that's a bit more long-lasting. And then all along, thinking about what policy change is required to make this stick. So at the work example, maybe it's around reducing the number of car spaces, or it's about providing more infrastructure to support people to take more active forms of travel. So you've got to think all along when you're doing these kind of engagements, what is those next steps? If we don't, then we might not get to that kind of final stage of institutionalizing the behaviours that we want to see. So I'm going to shift back to you lot now. So based on what I've just been saying, we've got an example here of this guy in front of his Lamborghini or some kind of flashy car. And he's this 30-something single man who's in love with their fast car. And they have spare cash and they're quite flashy. They like to show off and buy things that are on trend. and they've just moved to a new city. So if we want to get this guy driving less, what's the message and who is the messenger? Does anyone have any thoughts? So what might convince this guy, what might relate to his values, that might get him thinking, oh, maybe I will drive because of this alternative, and who would be the person to tell him that? Who might he trust? His mates? Yeah, Ben? Yeah, exactly. So someone who is similar to him.
I was going to say his gym mates.
His gym mates, yeah, you can tell he works out, so that
I
might be
guess.
really helpful. Yeah. And any others? His mum? Yeah. Possibly, yeah. And then what's the message? So what's the kind of the hook that we might get him to explore the idea of reducing his car journeys? A partner as well, Ken, that's a good idea. It's someone he trusts. Although sometimes when you're too close to home, sometimes, yeah, whether or not you listen to them. And yeah, okay, so we'll move on for now. I'm going to give you but we could say, so if he's going to drive less, so we need to find a way that would get him to do that. So it could be around encouraging him to take an e-scooter or something like that. But we need to find ways that will get him to shift. So it's about making it attractive for him. So what kind of action could that be? So if it wasn't an e-scooter, or if it isn't an e-scooter, how could we maintain him taking the car less and say taking an e-scooter more? So this is why the policy aspect might come into play. So what policy would we need to kind of put into place to support him to, say, scoot to the gym?
You could do rewards and incentives at the gym.
Nice.
So people who arrive get, a free protein shake or whatever.
For scooting.
Yeah.
Okay, nice.
Congestion charging.
Congestion charging. Okay, that'll do it. The carrots and the sticks. Yeah.
I see Mandy's typing something in the chat, but before
Okay,
Mandy's answer appears,
Yep.
Is there a bit around making it legal to scoot, for example? So making scooting available, and in terms of a technological perspective, it might go alongside that. Is a Lamborghini made an e-scooter? Maybe that might incentivize people.
Have they actually?
No.
Oh.
No. But
I had thought about that as a way to incentivize him, but then the way you said it, I was like, oh, they actually have already. They've beaten me to it.
I might suggest it.
Yeah, they need to have like the big symbol on the front of the e-scooter. Okay, nice. Incentive of racing bike to show off. Yeah, so the thing is, it needs like to fuel the idea of speed. I mean, ultimately, we want him to slow down. But yeah, you've got to start somewhere. So yeah, and Margarita, before I go.
Yes, so maybe I'm assuming that he wears a smartwatch or something like that. So maybe if that watch would have a workout that is associated with taking a scooter, not necessarily an e-scooter, but some sort of reward that he feels like he's working out already on the way to the gym or something.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, it's like combining all of his interests into one. And yeah, car is a status symbol, Mandy. I think we're not going to get him to move out of his car overnight, and maybe never will. But in terms of finding ways to reduce some of his car usage, maybe an e-scooter could be another flashy thing he could buy that he could then take an alternative. Of course, this model of buying more is not a way to go. So we've got to think about these aspects too. But yeah, we've got to keep all this in checks and balances, really. And then we've also got Paul saying emphasis, active travel is a better way to meet people in a new city. Absolutely. Yeah, and I was adding to that about how it might lead to more success at work, or because you get there feeling more energized. I mean, you'd have to actually make this a legitimate campaign, and it would have to be evidence-based. And the same with more dating. And again, this has to be linked to evidence, but these are the kind of ideas you could think about to work on. And then again with like Laura was mentioning, kind of incentives at the gym, so charging points as an example, or maybe outside of pubs, those kind of things. And And then active travel be more convenient and luxurious. Yeah, nice terminology. Cool. Okay, so they're just a few ideas that you could kind of play around with when you're thinking of engaging the audiences, of kind of what would appeal to them and which ways you can kind of open conversations and solutions you could potentially talk through. So excluding marginalized voices. So we've already mentioned this earlier on. For some, driving is unavoidable. For disabilities, as an example, or maybe it's your job. So at the current time, you need your car for being a builder, as an example. And for others, alternatives, and again, e-cars aren't the solution, but people who might see it as a potential stepping stone, not everyone can afford them. So we need, obviously, like those policy mechanisms in place to support those individuals. And I think a big way to overcome this, at least within our own groups, is to have those conversations. So if you've got ideas for making changes to your local environment, or you want to use your data and you've got a really great idea, it's consulting and hearing from the people that might be impacted by those changes, or what do people who are kind of more dependent on car usage, for example, what do they need? So it's co-creating solutions with all community stakeholders, and this does take time. So this is where it's really important to work with other campaign groups who are already doing a lot of this legwork, rather than feeling like we have to take it all on ourselves. So now for this final little segment, I'm going to talk about the policy change aspect. So again, like we've talked that this is a very long process. But this is going to give you just some ways in which to communicate, not necessarily it's going to give you the exact result and it will give it to you overnight, but it's some ways you can kind of communicate. So the first is obviously to consider who you need to influence. So analysing their motivations and their basis of power and yours. So their power could be any kind of resources that they have, money, connections. Maybe they are the ones who just sign off your proposal. And then also identifying the best way to influence them. So we've already heard from Paul, for example, that he's got good connections at the council. Maybe if it's a business that you're approaching, it's who's that right person, and spending time getting to know those right people. So again, it's a case of building trust, and also developing a well-crafted story, which I will explain momentarily. Also finding the right opportunities. So there may be upcoming consultations, community forums, various opportunities. So it's kind of keeping your ear to the ground to understand which opportunities might be the most appropriate for you, sharing your data and your potential solutions. So the kind of storytelling aspect, we need to really understand why this matters to the person that you're speaking to. So if it's the business owner, it's what it's going to do in terms of improving their business, or if it's for a local councillor who is really in support of green jobs, it's about kind of playing to their interests and motivations, like we talked about earlier. And then also understanding in the context of their stakeholders, their constituents, their customers, etc. And then use facts within their personal story. So here it's using data, so data that's come from the TELRAM and other sources that you may have, but within personal stories as well. So that could also be, and I say there, so it's the people that you're trying to amplify the voices of. So for example, more marginalised communities, or a specific group, for example, of mothers or whatever it may be. To explain their context and how that's important. And I think it's logos, pathos, and I can't remember the other one now, but it's ethos. But it's around using logic and using emotion, using different aspects to appeal. Laura's going to write it, thank you, to their values, and credos. So that's credibility, thank you. And so where possible, allow them to have a sensory experience. So that could be a video, for example, or it could be them playing with censor and being very abstract, because it will depend on your specific context, but rather than just an email, so in person, using videos, using photography that kind of tells the story in a more nuanced way is really helpful in trying to persuade and at least get the message across to these decision makers. Also being really goal and plan orientated, so making sure that you're kind of clear about what you're after. So SMART objectives, which are, I wrote these down because I always forget. So it's specific, measurable, actionable. I'm going to come back to that one. Time bound and realistic. So making sure that they're really clear and that they are within a certain time frame, for example, and that you're not asking for the world, and making sure it kind of fits in with an existing policy, for example. So like I was mentioning, not offering them a plan for the next 20 years, but something that can be implemented over 6 months to a year, for example, or working with their own existing plans and finding ways in which your ideas can kind of fit into what's already going on. And then obviously, depending on how much you know about these individuals, having that relationship is just really crucial. So obviously, if you know these individuals well, then you can actually have more of a slightly less serious conversation with them to just build rapport over time. But that will obviously depend on how well you know them. And yeah, it's frustrating. You can be knocking at doors for quite some time and not seem to be getting anywhere. But these processes do take time, and it's often finding that kind of that crucial person within the council, or finding the right connections. So, for example, what Paul was mentioning about, he already has that kind of doorway in. So it's finding those right people in the right places. And if needed, try again with another person, organisation, depending on your situation. And also learn from each encounter. So maybe something didn't work on that particular occasion. But you can always try again next time. That's a real whistle-stop tour from a communications perspective about engaging different audiences and about engaging policymakers. So I'd now like to spend some time just asking everybody to maybe reflect on what we've just discussed. So I've written here about takeaways and anything you will take forward, but equally add in stuff that you would like to add from your experiences, so things that work in engaging citizens or things that work with policymakers. We'd be really keen to hear. So does anyone have anything that they would like to comment on?
If I do, assuming I do raise to the council the new scores on the old tax office site, then yeah, I shall do a bit of planning. So yeah, so I've got a strategy for how I broach that, and yeah, we'll probably look at some of the WeCount data across the whole of Cardiff, not just my own data.
Super, thanks for that, Paul. Anyone else, any takeaways?
In our breakout room, we were discussing how we're seen by councillors now as no longer the right people to put this forward, because we've become the usual suspects. So a thing for me is like brokering relationships or alliances with other people who are the right messengers, and trying to there are various ways to do that. So one was a neighbourhood WhatsApp group. For me, I think we're working with our local church, Eco Church, because then they're more like the messengers of the council, who are older white men. So trying to form alliances, I think.
And like we were saying, it's finding people like them to communicate that message again, rather than what they see as angry activists or whatever the perception is. Great. Anyone else? All right then. So if that is that, then I will just leave with a few bits of signposting. So there's a link there to your list of councillors. If you are not aware, I'm going to be sharing these slides with all participants, so they'll have access to this as well. There is also a Ask Cardiff 2021 survey, launched by the council, and the deadline is on the 28th, which really doesn't give you much time, but that was the nearest opportunity that I found in terms of whether you want to contribute. And also, I'm not sure whether there's something that's similar that exists in Cardiff, but in Bristol we've got the opportunity to sign up to take part in various consultations throughout the year, and they kind of come through our letterbox. So I'm not sure if anyone's aware of those, but that would be worth signing up to if you've got something similar. Mandy?
I was just going to say, yeah, I'm taking away this idea of connecting with other groups and probably not giving in like I have in the past when I haven't been able to get through to a local councillor, because I do think things are changing. And I think the WhatsApp group for your street is a brilliant idea to engage with people who might not have the same views. And I do find that filling in all these consultations and surveys does work, because a lot of things that I've pushed for locally are happening. So I would encourage everybody to do those. And they don't know who you are, so you don't have to worry about, like a lady mentioned earlier, that feeling is as that the councils are starting to ignore you.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Mandy. And yeah, you can respond as an individual or on behalf of a group, so you can use it for your purposes. I have got a hand up. Yes, Jeremy.
Oh yeah, it's just one of the things I've been suggesting in a couple of groups is there are council elections next year, and so is to try and make sure that that's one of the doorstep things. So if you're in any groups, is to make sure that people say, oh, I just shut the door on them, but this is the opportunity to try and make it an issue, and that if enough representatives standing for election hear it again and again on the doorstep. It's one of the things we did with the dog control campaign. Was the stat was 1 in 3 households in the UK have a dog. So we said, what if every third house you went to on your campaign trail was a household with a dog that didn't like you banning them from being in certain parks and areas? And it did help to focus mind. So with the election next year, next May, if you got things that are quite hot and you sort of want to try and focus their minds, then try and use the doorstep visits and things, because it's one thing going to their surgeries and writing letters and things, but once you get them on the stump, and of course if you can say that across the community, then it does help to focus their minds.
Yeah, it's really great. And I'm wondering as well, if you've got the elections coming up next year, is there a forum or a way in which you as citizens can communicate to rally around that kind of common message? Or I guess you've got your own groups that you're working with.
But even if it's just a very local thing rather than sort of a citywide one, because I think Paul has probably found this as well, is that sometimes you get siloized on your sort of where the ward boundaries are. And when they sort of first started trialing 20-hour limits near us, I suggested that one of the roads would then see an increase in rat run traffic because it didn't have a 30 limit, and they said, but that's in the next ward. Because it was and it's like, please don't think of this as in like a silo way. You've got to look at the knock-on effect potentially, and in fact now that road has become a 20 limit as well. So it has ultimately, but it's taken a long time to get it done.
Yeah, really good input there. Thank you for that, Jeremy. I'm just going to move on because I'm aware of time, because I know Ben's got a few more things to say. But I would just leave you with this slide before handing back over, with some potential ideas for further exploration. So there's a few training resources that I've listed, and I'll get Ben to share these with you afterwards, for further training about engaging different audiences, for example, as well as some general resources about working in campaign groups. That Friends of the Earth has some really great things on their website, and also a shameless plug. We have just finished our WeCount advocacy pack. So it's a digital version of this kind of workshop that we've done. So I will share a link as well when I hand over to Ben. So thank you all for your time. I see that Ken is waving. So Ken, would you like to say something before I send over to Ben?
Brilliant. Thanks, Sophie. That was really interesting. And as a takeaway from me there is, in terms of that type of engagement, is to approach it constructively, carefully, and plan the approach in that engagement. And I think with enough weight and enough effort and enough evidence, I think we can all make really significant changes. I really liked the doorstepping of politicians, where politicians are coming to our door to push their agenda. It's sharing our agenda back with them, and the more people who are sharing the same agenda, you may get that shift directly into a politician's mindset, really. So thank you for that. So just very quickly, and I promise I will be short in this, in terms of WeCount itself. So WeCount as a project is coming to a close. A cup of tea in the evening, but I see a hand up.
Yeah, sorry, me. Are you kind of presenting or giving the kind of top level data to things like, you know, members of the Senate or Cardiff Council or the officers? Is there a kind of a route that you're doing that formally as part of the project kind of roundup finalisation?
So I don't know if anyone else wants to answer that at all. I can. So we don't have a formal route to present the data as it is, but that's something that is an interesting thing that we could do. It again, it depends on, as Sophie's mentioning, that advocacy and what are we trying to advocate for and highlight. So we need to essentially develop that logical strategy as to what we are using that data for, why we want to share it with those particular demographics. But you have access to all of the data as well, and we're more than happy to share that.
And I would say that Ender's also working quite closely with the council anyway, isn't he? So I'm sure when opportunities come up, and he's been sharing anecdotal stuff all along. I know there was discussion about the low traffic neighbourhoods, Ben, but I don't know whether that's progressed, has it, in terms of using WeCount?
That would Ender would have to answer that. I'm not sure.
Okay, but he's always got his finger on the pulse.
Yes.
Yeah, I just wonder about, so, you know, what some of the others on the sort of tonight think, whether perhaps it's not so much a particular message to put to the council on a particular point, but it is just kind of to say, look, this has been going on. This is the sort of data that's coming out of it. You know, we were very keen that these sort of messages are kind of listened to, and kind of that there being something that says, you know, across this city, there are people who have been involved with this, who are interested in it, who are concerned about it. That if they weren't aware of it before, just kind of supports that kind of message. There's not just one voice in one ward or one part of the city, but is kind of this much bigger group that kind of in some formal way, whether it's a little document or engaging with it with a couple of the key officers, just sort of. But you know, I'll throw that out there and see what other people think before we kind of come to a close.
I think I mentioned it in our little breakout group. I'm not sure I mentioned it in the kind of the wider forum. Cardiff Cycle City, we attend Cardiff Council's kind of semi-regular cycling advisory group forum, which is a meeting chaired by Cardiff Council that lots of organisations that are concerned with cycling in Cardiff attend, whether it's ourselves or cycling, the Welsh arm of Cycling UK, or whether it's Living Streets or Sustrans, Pedal Power, etc., etc. I'd be more than happy. I know Caro Wild is very aware of WeCount and Talent. I know Ender's had discussions with him. At the next cycling advisory group, I'd be happy to just spend a few minutes talking about mentioning that the the project is kind of formally wound up, but there is still, you know, a wealth of data which they can look at, you know, if they have a mind to.
That sounds really valuable. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Ben, I wonder, is there a final communication going around about the end of the project? Because maybe that's an opportunity to ask if people want to put their voice towards a document or a declaration or something.
Yeah, so what we'll be doing is we'll sending around an email to everyone who's been involved, and we can do exactly that. We can summarise, as we have done in some of these slides here, what the next steps are in terms of access to sensors, etc., but also what the next steps potentially could be in terms of that advocacy potential. I think that's a really nice idea.
Great. So is it the case that we need to get Paul's email and then you can...
So we will have Paul's email via the platform here.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, cool. And Andrew and Co got it, certainly, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Brill. Sounds like the making of something.
It does. And I will also say an apology from Ender, who's had real problems logging in tonight. And as all of us are, he's incredibly grateful for your input. And if he was here, he'd be saying exactly the same as we've just said now. So I'll push that apology on from Ender as well. But any other questions or comments